Next up is a woman who both of our directors mentioned and whose voice you heard throughout the documentary. Dr. Jean Theoharis is a distinguished professor of political science at Brooklyn College of City University of New York. She's also the author of the very book that the documentary is based on. It's also called The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. It won a 2014 NAACP Image Award and the Letitia Woods Brown Award from the Association of Black Women Historians, and appeared on the New York Times bestseller list. She's got another book. It's called A More Beautiful and Terrible History, The Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History, that won the 2018 Brooklyn Public Library Literary Prize in Nonfiction. It's so nice to see you. Thank you for joining me up here.
So nice to be here.
The book is phenomenal, and I think it's really what made the documentary so compelling and so interesting. Why rebellious when you were first working on this project as a book? Because I think if you went out in the street and polled people and said, you know, give me some adjectives to describe Rosa Parks, rebellious wouldn't have been one of them.
Right. So I originally wanted the book just to have a really plain title, because when we think about the big biographies of the big men, they all have this like very plain title. And then my publisher was like, no, you have to have the argument in the title. And so the title is actually taken from something Rosa Parks says about herself. She talks about having a life history of being rebellious. And that's the word she uses about herself. And so to flip it around, right, like, so the word rebellious life is both evoking what she says about herself, but again, it gets us to this, like, in some ways to say, this is not one moment, this is a lifetime, and that we don't know that lifetime, right? So we you know, so foregrounding the argument of the book in the title so that people were were forced to be like, I thought I knew who she was, and I thought I knew who she was, right? You know, and I think we all think we haven't fallen for the myth, right? Many of us are like, oh, I know she wasn't a simple seamstress. I know she was an NAACP secretary. But again, the whole section in Detroit, right? Like half of her life is spent outside of the South, fighting the racism of the Northern Promised Land that wasn't, in and alongside a Black Power movement, in and alongside a global freedom struggle. So she takes a stand in the early 60s on Vietnam. She takes a stand on US involvement in Central America. She's out on South Africa in the 60s already. I mean, so she's all of these things that I think even those of us who hadn't fallen for the like one day had still fallen for a gendered kind of smaller version of kind of this freedom, this lifetime freedom fighter.
Johanna tells a great story about how she sort of first got connected to you, which was on Twitter, RIP Twitter, I have to say. But Twitter was the place, right, where she said she would follow you, right. And at once a year, you would sort of post sort of thoughts about Rosa Parks. And she'd say, you know, the first one was like, oh yeah, I kind of knew that. Second one was like, interesting, but I kind of knew that. Then you'd get to the third thing, and the fourth, and she said she couldn't believe all of this data and information around Rosa Parks when she sort of felt like, I'm a well-read person who doesn't fall for the mythology. How do I not know all of this? Was there something that surprised you about the story of Rosa Parks when you first started working on your book?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I spent 6 years working on the book and then have worked on it sort of since then as well for the film. But, I mean, her life is so huge. And I just, over and over, it's like, here she is at the Black Panther Party school. Here she is, you know, protesting outside the South African embassy. Here she is in the 1940s doing all of this, like traveling across Alabama, taking testimony to try to bring cases against like white brutality and white sexual violence, right? Like she's everywhere. I don't know if people remember that goofy film, Forrest Gump. Mm-hmm. Right, where Forrest shows up everywhere in all these different historical moments, but as an historian, that's what it started to feel like. It's just like, here she is, and here she is, and here she is, and here she is, and in some ways, because she's fierce but reserved, right? She's hidden in plain sight in a lot of ways. So she's there if you're looking, except we're often not looking, and so that was part of the joy of it, but it was, and I guess the second, I mean, the second half of her life in Detroit. I mean, how many people here, if you hadn't read the book or hadn't seen the film before today, knew that she had a whole, like, usually when people talk about Detroit, it's like and she lived happily ever after in Detroit. Not like she moves there when she's like 44 and then she'll spend another 45 years fighting. And then all the Black Power stuff, right?
One of my favorite lines is when the reporter is asking her about the racism of the South, and she's like, "In the North," just kind of throws it on in there. There is an interview with one of the Black Lives Matter's co-founders, Patrisse Cullors, and she talks about this idea of people being comfortable when history is devoid of strategy, that it just feels soft and squishy and easy. Why do we love the mythology versus tactics and strategy, which we know historically, and I'm going to say at this moment in time specifically, works and is often put to very effective use?
I mean, I think the mythologies of Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, since we're coming up on the holiday, are used in ways to make it seem comfortable, like how change happens is comfortable. And in fact, it was deeply uncomfortable, right? We see her getting death threats and hate mail, not just in 55 in Montgomery, right? But in 67 in Detroit, right? I think that's uncomfortable, right? I think if we see her for years and years trying to change things, right? To me, the most inspiring thing about Rosa Parks is the ways she keeps going, even though she feels crazy, even though she feels lonely, right? Both in the 40s and early 50s, and then she keeps going, right? Many of us would have been like, okay, I did my time, right? And that feeling, like to me, the inner Rosa Parks, right? The keeping going sense. But I think the way she gets memorialized is somehow you can like fall into history. You can do something on one day that changes everything. Of course that's not how it works, but it'd be nice if that's how it worked. It would be nice if like shining a light on injustice in this country actually fixed the injustice. I think that's the seductiveness of the Rosa Parks story, right? Is this idea that no one had done it before, right? That she somehow sits down, she's some sort of accidental actor, right? When I think the story, I mean, 10 to 15,000 rides a day they're giving. We don't know that part of the Montgomery bus boycott. It's super organized, right? It works because it's organized, right? I mean, in my head, it was like, oh, they're just walking. That was that's the middle school version, right? They just walk. Yes, of course they walk. But how you sustain a year-long bus boycott is you develop an incredibly organized set of pickup stations. So I think part of what we can take from her and from this history is how much work it is how hard it is how discouraging it is, right? I think there's something comforting about seeing that our greatest heroes also felt crazy, also felt lonely, also felt like things weren't changing, right? Because it requires a lot of time in the wilderness, right? And so I think that's what her real history gives us, but I think the way she's memorialized makes it seem like, well, there's something wrong with us if we make a stand on injustice and it doesn't change everything like apparently it did with the Montgomery bus boycott, but obviously that's not how it worked.
What do you think ultimately her legacy is then, and its relevance to, in just a few minutes we're going to be talking to our young activists. Things are so different today. No one's meeting at the church in order to plan out strategy and typing it on a typewriter and sending notes around. What's her legacy?
Well, I think part of her legacy, and we saw a lot of this in the film, but there's even more in her like full story. I mean, one of her lifelong commitments was challenging injustices in the criminal legal system, challenging police brutality. We saw that People's Tribunal in Detroit in 1967 when the cops are not going to be indicted, right? So they're at least trying to expose the truth. We saw her trying to get justice for black people who were wrongfully accused, right? Like Scottsboro. We saw her working on cases like Joanne Little of black women who had been victims of sexual violence. So I think her greatest legacy today is, in many ways, to disregard, I think, some of the ways in this moment people are like, to Black Lives Matter, oh, it's not like how it was in the civil rights movement. You should be more like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. It's just like, if we're going to be like Rosa Parks, What it means is to be a lifelong fighter against the criminal legal system. What it means is to take stand after stand against police brutality. What it means is to be an opponent of the death penalty. What it means is to understand that the criminal justice system is riven with racism, right? That's the legacy she gives us, because that's what she does from the 30s to the 90s, right, is work on those kinds of issues. And so I think the legacy she gives us is, in fact, I think the last thing I'm going to say, even though my time is way up, is how...
You know what? You have a hot mic. Go for it. Take your time.
Is that we saw her trust young people. And I think that's the other thing she gives us, is she was somebody who followed young people.
Amazing. Jean Theoharis is the excellent author of the book upon which the documentary is based. Jean, thank you. Professor Theoharis, appreciate it.